It was a foggy evening. The soft air and light from the street lamps filtered through the train windows. The light, filtered by heavy clouds and lingering humidity, cast subtle shadows through the windows, like hands seeking to grasp the fleeting thoughts of the passengers. The regular sound of the wheels against the rails had something reassuring, like a familiar melody that lulls the mind, a constant, almost hypnotic rhythm. However, at the bottom of this noise, another vibration was felt, imperceptible but definitely there. A tension in the air, a tension that we feel without really knowing where it comes from. The concentrated faces of the travelers, the sounds of turning pages, the whispered conversations were all drowned in this silence heavy with unsaid. Sitting near the window, Adama observed the passing landscape from a certain distance. The wheat fields, the abandoned country houses, everything passed before her like a series of moving paintings. Her thoughts escaped, wandering between the present and the past, between the ups and downs of her fighting career, between her victories and her sacrifices. She thought back to her last fight, the one that had sealed her place among the greatest, a hard-fought victory that still rang in her ears like the sound of a gong. But behind this victory, there were the long nights of training, the pain, the doubts. This wasn't a simple victory over an opponent. It was a victory against a world that had often told her she could never be enough. She had taken this train to reunite with her family, after weeks of focusing on her next match. She had chosen the train for its calm, for the break it represented. But at that precise moment, this calm seemed illusory. There was something in the air, an electric thrill that crept slowly, making its way into his mind. She lost herself in thought, wondering if this tranquility was really what she wanted or if, deep down, she was looking for a form of chaos that was more like her. She knew what it was, this constant inner struggle, this need to push one's own limits ever further. After all, that was what had brought her this far. But tonight, it wasn't a fight in a ring, it was another kind of fight, a more insidious, more subtle fight. Adama was black, proud and strong. These words resonated within her, like a familiar melody, but tonight, she did not yet know that she was going to have to put them to the test. His mind, as sharp as his fists, knew that any moment could turn into a challenge. She had worked hard to break the invisible chains of injustice, to redefine what it meant to be a woman in a sport where men still largely dominated. But tonight, on this train, his biggest challenge wasn't an opponent in the ring. It was the unknown who was going to cross his path and who, without knowing it, was going to awaken a force that he was not ready to face. He entered the wagon like a lion who thought the savannah belonged to him. He had this confident, almost arrogant gait, as if each step resonated with an invincible certainty. Dressed in an impeccably cut suit, his appearance exuded power and superiority. He glanced furtively around him, scanning the faces of the passengers with cold indifference, until his eyes landed on Adama. He stared at her for a moment, his gaze hardening. He judged her in a split second, analyzing her posture, her tranquility, her black features as if she were a simple image that he could erase with a movement of his hand. Then, suddenly, he moved towards her without hesitation, his heavy step marking the ground like a hammer blow. Once he reached him, he stopped abruptly. There was neither politeness nor respect in his voice, only a raw demand, as if his status gave him all the rights. "You over there need to leave this seat," he said, in a loud voice, full of self-proclaimed authority, as if there was no room for discussion. Adama looked up, her eyebrows raising slightly, marking the first break in her apparent calm. She didn't even need to answer right away. The piercing look she gave the man was enough to make him understand that he was not facing someone he could dominate so easily. She knew exactly what he was referring to. It wasn't just a question of space on the train. No, what he wanted was much more subtle, much more insidious. He wanted his seat, not because it was assigned, but because he believed that a black woman, especially a fighter, had no right to sit in a space he felt was reserved for people of her rank. In his eyes, she could read what he was thinking, the judgments he made without even realizing it. He thought she was there by mistake, that a person of her condition did not have the right to benefit from what he considered a privilege. He believed that his status alone, his appearance, was enough to determine who could be there and who could not. This kind of look, This kind of thought, Adama had encountered many times in his life. But today, it wasn't a simple look of condescension she was going to face. It was an old form of racism, the kind that hides behind innocuous words and rejects a person because of who they are, not what they have accomplished. "I won't leave my seat," she replied calmly, her voice deep and calm, a quiet assurance that came from deep within her. She didn't need to get angry or raise her voice. Every word was measured, every syllable carried with silent strength, a promise not to give in to this form of humiliation. She knew he wasn't expecting such a calm, firm response. He expected submission, fear, a step back, but Adama was not that kind of woman. The man, surprised by her response, shrugged his shoulders, his arrogance feeding off what he thought was a lack of understanding on her part. But the truth was that Adama understood perfectly what he was implying. He wanted to force her to give in, not because he was within his rights, but because he felt that a woman like her, a black woman, a fighter, was not entitled to the same dignity as him.
"Do you hear me? This seat belongs to me."
"You people like you never understand," he said, his voice becoming colder, more acerbic, as if, suddenly, he went from irritation to disapproval. The entire carriage froze, a heavy silence falling over the atmosphere. The other passengers, until then absorbed in their own worlds, suddenly seemed to realize that they were witnessing something bigger than a simple altercation. Nervous glances met each other, people trying to avoid conflict, as if afraid that their presence would make things worse. Some looked down, not wanting to get involved in what seemed like a simple quarrel. But others, those who understood that this was more than just a disagreement, began to observe carefully. They saw behind the man's attitude a social problem that Adama knew well. It wasn't just a question of space on a train. It was a symbolic clash, a clash between the vision of a world that sought to assign roles to individuals based on the color of their skin and another, fairer world where everyone could stand in their place with dignity, regardless of color, gender, or background. They were witnesses to a silent, almost invisible, but essential fight that many ignored or chose to ignore. Adama did not let himself be intimidated. She stood slowly, each movement measured, like a warrior preparing for a mental fight as fierce as any physical fight. Her gaze did not turn away from the man who, at that precise moment, still thought he could make her bend. His black eyes stared at the man with an intensity that paralyzed him for a moment. He was no longer the superior man he thought he was. He was a child facing a woman who knew very well what she was worth. "I understand very well," she said, and her words were as sharp as a knife.
"You don't decide what's mean or not."
The heavy silence that settled in the carriage was heavy with meaning. The passengers, hanging in suspense, held their breath. Some seemed hesitant, wondering if they should intervene, but most preferred to remain in the shadows, not wanting to take a position in a moment that would define much more than a simple exchange of words. The tension was palpable, like a vice tightening around the group. But Adama did not look down. She knew the humiliation wouldn't come from her. She was not a victim. Not today. Not here. And it wasn't her who was going to give in to the verbal violence that was imposed on her. She felt every look that fell on her, the curiosity, the embarrassment, the uncertainty. But none of them really understood. None of them knew what it was like to struggle, to have to prove your worth every moment just to exist in a world that was constantly trying to crush you. This silence, although heavy, was not fear, it was an expectation. They were all waiting to see if Adama would fold. They were waiting to see if, faced with the unjustifiable, she would give in. The man, annoyed by Adama's lack of submission, decided to take things further. He didn't want to just push her back with words. He wanted to break her, make her feel small, insignificant. He called a member of the train staff, demanding that he remove Adama from his seat. He believed that his authority, his impeccable suit, and his contempt would be enough to get what he wanted. The controller arrived quickly, a man with an indifferent face, who, seeing the man in the suit, first took his side. He had seen conflicts like this hundreds of times. One disgruntled passenger, another who refused to submit. It happened, but it was never as simple as that. "Ma'am, you have to leave this seat," he said casually, as if he was simply ordering someone to move in a crowded waiting room. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. There was no hesitation, no doubt. He had seen the well-cut suits. He knew where the power resided in this place. Adama crossed her arms slowly, her gaze intensifying, a calm and implacable determination unfolding in every fiber of her being. She didn't rush to respond, but when she did, her words were as sharp as steel. "No," she replied simply, her voice deep, each syllable marked with certainty. "I'm a paying customer. This seat is mine. And I have no intention of leaving it." His eyes didn't leave the controller. He was there, waiting for her to give in, but she wouldn't give him that pleasure. There was a silent fervor in his eyes, a deep resolution that made him waver for a fraction of a second. He turned to the man in the suit, who seemed increasingly agitated. The man frowned, impatience and frustration written on his face. "She refuses to leave, sir," the conductor said, his tone almost matter-of-fact, but it was obvious that he was uncomfortable with the situation.
What do you want, Metodo?
The man straightened up, his arrogance now coupled with cold anger. "Tell him to move, or I'll press charges for disruptive behavior," he said sharply, as if he was certain that his threat would be enough to resolve the incident. For him, it was a formality. It wasn't the first time he used this method to put people in their place, to silence them, to make them bend under the guise of power. Adama felt the situation escalate, but instead of reacting with anger or frustration, she took a deep breath. A breath of fresh air that reminded her how she had already survived much harder things. Her fists clenched, her body tense from the inside. She knew she had to stay calm. That was the key. Never let yourself be carried away by violence. Never give in to the temptation to act out of anger. She was beyond that. She then slowly turned towards the other passengers, looking them all in the eyes, one by one. It was a silent challenge, an invitation to see beyond the simple spectacle they were observing. "What this man forgets," she said in a clear, calm voice, but full of quiet strength, "is that being black, I am often considered less than what I am. But today, I am going to show you that dignity, respect, and inner strength are what matters. It is not him who will take away my place, nor me nor any of you." The man in the suit blushed, taken aback by Adama's quiet strength. He didn't expect this answer. Everything in his attitude had been calculated, every word spoken to establish a form of domination, every gesture designed to show his superiority. But facing Adama, he suddenly felt vulnerable, trapped in a game he hadn't anticipated losing. The silence in the car became heavy, the atmosphere charged with the shock wave of a moral confrontation. It was as if the air had become denser, thicker, saturated with palpable tension. Each passenger held their breath. The scene they observed went beyond the altercation to a moment of much greater significance. It was a duel of wills, a confrontation between the pride of one who thought he had absolute power and the dignity of a woman who refused to bend. It was then that another passenger, a man with a casual appearance but eyes bright with understanding, stood up. He was neither young nor old, but his gaze carried a weight not usually found in the closed faces of those who preferred to ignore injustices. He had observed the scene without intervening until now, preferring to observe the dynamics, take the temperature of the situation. But at this precise moment, he could no longer remain inactive. It was no longer a simple question of comfort or awkward silence. It was a question of justice. A fundamental principle had been shaken in this confined space, and he knew it was too late to look away. "I agree with her," he said as he stood up, his tone firm, his voice carrying a quiet authority that surprised even the most discreet passengers. He stepped forward without hesitation, his approach resolute, and headed directly towards the controller. "If you move her, I'll get off at the next station with her. You have no right to treat her that way." He was not asking, he was imposing a reality. He was no longer just another passenger. He had become an actor, a living witness to the resistance. The controller, caught off guard, swallowed and tried to respond, but his voice was lost in the growing tension. His gaze searched for an escape, a justification, but none came. He was nothing more than a simple cog in a system that he knew was fragile and unstable. The authority he thought he had was now being tested. What could he say in the face of such solidarity? Faced with this gesture of courage which shifted the balance of power in the car, Adama smiled inwardly, proud to see that the tide was turning in her favor, but she didn't let anything show. Her calm remained unwavering. She knew that this victory was not measured by a burst of triumph, but by how small, invisible battles led to fundamental change. She settled back into her seat, more imposing than ever. There was something majestic in his posture. This was not the attitude of a woman fighting for a simple seat, but of a person asserting her right to dignity and respect. Every movement of her body seemed to strengthen her position, anchored in the certainty of what she stood for. Meanwhile, some passengers began to murmur, a breeze of solidarity blowing through the carriage. Others, shy but determined, began to make gestures of support. Hands were barely raised, but looks changed.
No more embarrassment. No more restraint.
Some spoke out in his defense, not out of fear, but because they knew that remaining silent would be a betrayal of their own humanity. It was as if a collective awareness was dawning among them. The invisible barrier that separated people was cracking under the weight of a simple but powerful truth. Injustice must not be accepted, even in the most insignificant moments. The man in the suit, humiliated and now alone in his anger, finally understood that the power he thought he held was only an illusion. The walls of his authority, which had so easily risen around him, were crumbling. He turned on his heel, his face now marked with embarrassment and frustration. Without a word, he walked away towards another carriage. There was no more room for him here. Respect, dignity, solidarity had excluded him from the space he thought was due to him. The truth had rejected him as brutally as his arrogant posture had brought him closer to failure. This was the end of the conflict, but it was also the beginning of a silent change in the minds of each of the passengers present. The glances exchanged, the whispered conversations at the back of the carriage, the way people adjusted their positions. All of this signaled a turning point. Solidarity had triumphed, not in violence, but in the calm affirmation of what is just. Passengers now knew that there were times when it was necessary to stand up for what is morally and humanly right, even when it seemed like a losing battle. It was not a great revolutionary act, but it was a significant act of resistance in a world that is too often indifferent. The space that had been filled with uncertainty was slowly emptied of a tension that we never thought possible to dissipate so quickly. The air seemed lighter, more breathable, as if the scene had left behind something bigger than a simple confrontation, something that would last long after the train had left the station. Thus, the confrontation ended. But the echo of solidarity, dignity and resistance would continue to resonate, in memories and in consciences. The lesson was simple, but radical. There is no such thing as a small injustice.